Hello and welcome to the first episode of Nationalist Scorecard. I am Matthew Drake, and I'm very pleased that you've joined us. Now, we're going to be diving into Stefan Molyneux today, and it's very appropriate that I've chosen Steph because he was actually the first person who I chose to illustrate on my channel, and the person who has had the most illustrated philosophy videos. So if you don't know who this person is, he is the host of the largest philosophy show in the world, and his podcast, Free Domain Radio, has been running since 2006. So about 12 years this guy has been putting out content. And now I will admit that I have, a personal bias towards him, and I very much respect this man. But I think it's for good reason. He's one of those characters who I think will have a much greater impact on the world even after he's dead than when he's alive. And this is a way of saying that he will hopefully go down in the history books as a legendary figure. That might surprise a lot of people, but I think it is merited, and that is where my gut points me to. So this guy was doing podcasting before it was popular, and what I really like about his approach to philosophy, to politics, to current events and everything is that he builds from a foundation, and you can go look at his introduction to philosophy, and he's very grounded in objective reality and empiricism. So we're going to talk about some of those things going forward. But keep in mind that this is about nationalism. It's a nationalist scorecard, and so some of the things that I might want to talk about, they may or may not fit in with the nationalist idea, and so it might be that I have to come and talk more on another episode about him, but we'll see. So let's start with the top of the scorecard: opposing open borders. I give Stefan an A for this category. This was not always the case, right? He is an anarcho-capitalist, but his viewpoints on open borders and immigration has changed greatly since the days which he was associating more with just your run-of-the-mill libertarians. And this is a common pattern. This is the case for me. This is the case for a lot of people who make up the alt-right. And they were into the Ron Paul movement. Now, actually, he sidestepped the whole Ron Paul thing and was more advocating that political action is pointless and it's not going to get us anywhere. And he sort of carried that forward up until the election of Donald Trump, which he sort of realized that, okay, there could be a set of circumstances where someone comes along and does change things for the better, but it's still going to be very rare, right? And so he still considers himself an anarcho-capitalist and all that. We can get into that more, but yeah, I want to, as I was saying, he grounds his arguments in empiricism. And you might have, the kind of meme that goes around him is, that is not an argument. And he's kind of famous for having said that. Not an argument. He's replying to a comment or something like that. It's true. It's a lot of times people are just throwing sludge in your face and they don't know how to argue. And I have, I'm going to quote from his book, The Art of the Argument, because I think this sums up nicely, and I'll tie it into the open borders thing, but sums up nicely why people regard him so highly, right? He says, the argument cannot be separated from empiricism, since the consistency and predictability of empirical matter is what gives the argument its structure, providing its requirement for rational consistency. The structure and properties of the argument are directly derived from the structure and properties of empirical reality, and so even if an argument has no effect on empirical reality, it is still derived from empirical reality. Thus, the argument is not designed to change minds, but rather to change behavior. A dietitian is not primarily trying to change your mind, but your eating habits. Changing your mind is necessary, but not sufficient. A piano teacher is not trying to get you to practice, but to improve your playing. Practicing is necessary, but not sufficient. A moralist, a philosopher, is not trying to change your mind, but your behavior. He is trying to stimulate your moral courage or integrity or consistency to provoke behavioral changes of some kind. If you doubt this, I challenge you to imagine an argument that produces no change behaviors whatsoever. All arguments are arguments for empirical action. The argument without empiricism is not the argument. And so, when you compare this to much of modernity and much of the academic world, which calls themselves philosophers, it's night and day, because he is primarily grounded in what is going to affect your life. What are the choices that you can make and actions you can take which will change your life, right? So he's not just like preaching to some kings. He's not talking to only the elite. He's talking to really everyone, and that is an inspiring message because it means that it's a philosophy for the masses. It is something that even if you don't understand all of the details of the argument and the logical trees which lead you to a certain conclusion, you can still respect the process of critical thinking and internal consistencies and all these things which he talks about in his book, which an argument needs. And the argument is meant to prompt people into action, to take action in their lives. And this is something that he has integrated and woven into his beautiful prose. He can paint these imaginative scenes with words, and it's that aspect alone, that ability is remarkable. But the fact that he weaves in all of this philosophical fundamentals is really admirable. And so when it comes to open borders and immigration in particular, we see that he changed his mind because he received new data over the years. He received data such as the raping and the welfare usage of, in Europe, often Islamic migrants and so on, and in the United States, Hispanic and Latin immigrants. So empiricism is not enough by itself, right? The fact that you give the statistics for welfare usage of non-natives or immigrant populations in Western countries, that fact alone does not mean that we must restrict immigration, but it is a contributing factor in building up a case. And unfortunately, what a lot of people want to do is start from their conclusion and work backwards, and therefore they go and cherry pick data to represent their case. And to some degree, it's impossible to avoid this because there's only so much data you can present, right, that's relevant. You're always going to be leaving out something. People are always going to come back at you, well, what about this? Oh, I found an exception, blah, blah, blah. But when we're looking at general trends, which is what government policy, if it's going to exist, should be based on, is overall trends, because we're not basing government policy on an individual circumstance. It's based on the larger population. So we can test our hypotheses and come up with a conclusion. And so with regards to immigration, this means that all of these factors, the differences in race, differences between the races in outcomes, which we'll touch on in the next point, these all build up a case. A lot of people want to tie libertarianism to open borders, and that's just absurd, right? That's just saying that in order to be free, we can't ever have any barriers between peoples. We can't ever freely associate and exclude certain groups of people. And that's absurd. That's not freedom at all. So Stefan has often pointed out this fact, that open borders is just another government program. He is clearly not somebody who is in favor of fascism or any hardcore right-wing authoritarianism, right? He rails against that on occasion, but he's also looking at where we are in the society and using that to direct where he focuses his energies. So let's move on to cultural Marxism, and on this one I gave him an A+. And the reason I gave him this grade is because he is adamantly opposed to Marxist doctrine, certainly economically, but as I said before, the culture right now, the communists lost the economic battle, and therefore what they decided to do was sneak into the institutions and propagate their ideas from there by race baiting, by pitting groups against each other, and by proposing relativism, essentially. Relativism and nihilism are the bedrock, really, of cultural Marxism. And Stefan counters relativism with objectivism. And of course, he is a fan of Ayn Rand and the objectivist philosophy. Or I shouldn't say fan. I hate it when people use that word. But he grew up in that era and has still to this day a great respect for Ayn Rand, even though he has some disagreements. So he pushes hard against this idea of relativism. And I'm going to quote from yet another of his books, Universally Preferable Behavior, where he's talking about objective truth. He says, "A central challenge in understanding the nature of truth is the realization that truth does not exist in the world in the same way that a rock or a tree does." And as an aside, keep this quote in mind because it'll be important when I talk about religion in a little bit. The concept truth is necessarily a relative term, though that does not mean a subjective or arbitrary term. The concept health is also a relative term. We compare health to sickness, and also to relative standards of health. What is considered good health for a 90-year-old would scarcely be considered good health for a 20-year-old. Right, so those are the two pillars of truth, is internal consistency and empiricism, or logic and empiricism. As long as something does not contradict itself, then the first place to look to test your hypothesis about a certain thing is to look in the real world and see what the outcomes are. And you may be familiar with Steph's infamous data-rich presentations of PowerPoint presentations, and he gives these great charts, which are great to snapshot and put on Twitter and just red pill all kinds of people. Everything from the truth about feminism to the truth about racial hierarchies and race and IQ. He's contributed so much to these things which put dents into the cultural Marxist worldview. And so the cultural Marxists, they have to rely on indoctrination. And that is something in their favor. If people have spent 20 plus years in government schools, then telling them that there are problems with the government, or even that that there are evils in this system, and the evils in funding education through public tax dollars, which are stolen from the population. This just doesn't register with people because they swim in it. It's like a fish discovering water for the first time. Well, you can't understand it unless you are not swimming in water. And also, Steph is great at weaving in elements of history. I know that he's kind of a history buff and he's studied history and economics, so he really does like to bring in experts from the historical point of view, from the biological point of view, all of the actual sciences out there. And that's not to say that like there can't be any social science which is productive. It's just that right now the academic social sciences have been so corrupted and so parasitized, if I could make up a word. There are parasites that are glomming onto this field of study and using exclusion and political correctness and all the pressure techniques to make it so that you can't actually go out there and study these things without getting a huge amount of backlash. You can't study race. You can't study certain habits of ethnic tribes throughout history and make conjectures about those and have hypotheses which people refute in good faith. You can't do any of this because of the oppressive culture that we find ourselves in. But Steph, he has found, amazingly, people who are doing this work. It's really good, actually, for the field of social science in general, because I think he gives them a platform to come out and talk about these things. And, if you write a book and you're just relying on word of mouth to get it out, it's extremely difficult. If you don't have an established academic publisher, if you don't have these credentials and stuff that for many, many years was the only way to get information out there. And now all of that's changed with the internet, and Steph has been at the cusp, the cutting edge of that in distributing information. And so this incentivizes other people to do it, because now there's a possibility that they can actually make money. One thing you have to admire about Steph, whatever you think of his opinions, is that he's a great businessman. He has, from the beginning, approached his work as a business that allows him to be effective. At the same time, he's not beholden to these great interests. He doesn't do commercials, etc. So that's it's noteworthy. It's admirable that he's been able to remain independent this whole time. I think it shows something about his character. So we will move on then to support for free speech. I think that, like a lot of people, when Stefan found out about the arrest of Tommy Robinson, he was outraged and dismayed. And it is kind of interesting to just see him, not that he's hopeless, but you can see that he's repositioning himself a little bit to talk to the people on the other side of whatever calamity seems like is going to befall the West, whether it's a massive recession, economic collapse. He's said multiple times that the economic system just can't continue. I would probably agree with him, but there's no way to tell how long it could go. Some people didn't think it'd last this long. But eventually, yes, it will probably experience some kind of hardship, whether it's war or famine or something that will knock people into their senses. And I see him sort of repositioning where he is talking to sort of the people on the other side so that we don't get into this situation again. That makes sense. The job of a philosopher is prevention, not cure. And so how much can you really prevent when your society is crumbling before your eyes? You can do some good, and you can set up the groundwork for something to come along much greater afterwards. And so hopefully that stuff will all get preserved. But yes, freedom of speech is one of the most worrying things. And, white people largely have been in support of free speech. But we see across the board, free speech is declining. And it's partly because we have all of these culture clashes that are happening, and people just, they don't trust other people because they are worried that these sophistries, this rhetoric is going to influence the masses in a way, and it's going to harness this energy and direct it in a fist, in the form of a fist, towards some great change, right? And so each side, if you look at the traditional left-right dichotomy, I'm less and less dependent on that now. Each side is really getting more and more vehement in opposition to the other side, and it's a polarization. And so we see free speech, support for absolute free speech declining. Of course, you don't need free speech for just the meaningless chitter-chatter, right? You need free speech for the things that are upsetting, for the things that criticize those who are in power. So I'd like to read to you another quote about conformity. I don't remember which podcast this was, but Steph once said, "Conformity is secured with respect and cooperation, and deviance is punished with disrespect, ridicule, and withdrawal of cooperation. In a war, sacrificing one's life for the group without hesitation is praised as heroism. Those who deviate from this standard of conduct are censored and punished by the others, but the norms are usually so internalized that they do not require enforcement." Unlike a lot of the cultural Marxists, if you will, the coastal elites who use freedom to kind of coalesce their own power in the hope that they can gain power for themselves and use that conformity that is natural to a populace and use that to their advantage. Steph, on the other hand, wants to, I believe, improve the system which conformity is designed to protect. And this is why he consistently advocates for anarcho-capitalism. Anarcho-capitalism doesn't say people should not conform. It means that those who do not want to conform should have the freedom to not overthrow the system, but separate from it, to leave from it. And in voluntary exchanges, we see this all the time. You are allowed to leave your job if you don't like the working conditions, if you think you can get a better pay somewhere else. But the job is providing you with value, i.e. money. We don't know if the government is providing us with value, because value is a subjective thing. So I think this is where people get tripped up with anarchism, is they think, there's going to be no rules, there's going to be no enforcement of anything. That's absolutely false. The idea is you will be subjected to whatever you agree to. Just like at a job, you're expected to show up at 8, otherwise you're fired. You have people who hear anarchy and they think, somebody is eventually going to come along and they're going to have so much power that they're just going to be able to force people to do whatever they want, and they won't be able to leave because they'll have so much power. Who's going to oppose them? If you're the most powerful person in the world, then who's going to watch the watchers? It's that kind of argument. But when you realize that social conformity is such a massive, massive force, then you realize that it's going to be, the best ideas are going to rise to the top, and the best organizations which are run, because people have this freedom to switch from one to the other. It's not a realistic possibility that there's just going to be, one person or one organization that has all the power. Even if you admit a scenario where that's possible, that just means we're right back where we are now. So it's no better, no worse. Well, it is better. It actually is better, because you've at least had this idea implemented throughout the consciousness of the population that things are not right, that that's not how it's supposed to be. And so you're going to have some kind of insurrection at some point. The problem with the way that government is now is that they do have all the power, and people don't realize just how totalitarian it is, just how much their lives are affected by the actions of government. They actually have this idea that government is still protecting them. All right, condemned by elite. Oh, so I don't know if I said this. Free speech got an A. Condemned by elite, A-. The interesting thing is that when Steph was more libertarian, he really didn't get that much backlash. He got some backlash from the people who didn't like his personal advice, his advice about the family, for instance. There were some articles, some bad press about him. But ultimately, he didn't face a lot of opposition by the mainstream, because the mainstream just ignores libertarians. Because libertarians are doing a great job. Libertarians are siphoning off Republicans, and that helps the Democrats. So he definitely wasn't seen as a threat back then, but now he is considered part of that intellectual dark web. And he's the edgy part of the dark web, right? Of course, they don't list any alt-right figures in there, right? They don't list anyone who's really pushing back and advocating for explicit, either white nationalism or white sovereignty or anything like that. But he's close enough to that realm that he's just a pariah. He's not somebody that you're allowed to associate with. And I remember Sam Harris one time said, I'm not a fan of Douglas Murray because he went on Stefan Molyneux's podcast, and Molyneux one other time had on Jared Taylor. And so the association, even though it's a couple steps removed, is enough for me to say I have to distance myself from Douglas Murray. Not even distance myself from Steph, distance myself from people who have associated with him. And that's just kind of absurd in my mind. It really demonstrates that power of ostracism that we were talking about earlier, and conformity. It really works. If people apply the right pressure in certain places, they can really control the population. So I actually want to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about Steph's arguments for, or rather against, God or gods. When I first read his book Against the Gods several years ago, close to 7 years ago, maybe 6, I really couldn't refute any of the arguments. And to this day, I will agree with him on really a lot, 99%. And I think that if we were to have a conversation, we would find that we don't differ all that much on the religious issue. You could say that Steph pulled me towards atheism, and Jordan Peterson kind of pulled me back the other way towards God. So what are the arguments that he makes, real quickly? Well, one has to do with complexity and how God could not be this really complex being, because they say he's in our image and we are complex beings that have evolved. And so how could there be this God who's super complex when he existed before the creation of the universe? A lot of people will try to put God outside of time or something like this. And it's really not an answer at all, because if you're outside of time, then you're not dealing with reality. I agree with all that. His arguments about, you can't be omniscient and all-powerful at the same time. That's a self-contradiction, because how could you, if you're all-powerful, then you would be able to change something. But if you can change something in the future, then how would you know that it's going to happen? And so I say all of these things are solved by defining God as that which is necessary for the maintenance of civilization. I mean, that's it. That's it in a nutshell. People fight about what is it that makes our civilization. There's this talk about Enlightenment values, and that's certainly a part of it. But that can't be all of it, right? Because you need some kind of nationalism and borders to protect against outsiders and foreigners. So I think that Christianity has been one of the most successful boilerplates for how to create a successful civilization. And a successful civilization, unfortunately, does not require truth. Let me rephrase that. It does not require small truths at the expense of much larger truths. And so I think the question that current cultural Christians grapple with is, can we have a civilization without the lie that God exists, God is a being, a physical being or something? He exists, and you could measure him somehow if only we had the ability. I say no, that's not necessary. And to go back to where Steph is talking about truth, he says, truth does not exist in the world in the same way that a rock or a tree does. It's a relative term, though that does not mean a subjective or arbitrary term. So, think about numbers. Numbers don't exist in the real world, but they are objective in what they signify. They tell us important information about the world, and that communicates something valuable. God is the same way. It's somewhere in this intersection between psychology and biology. And I think eventually we will get to the point where maybe we still have a lot of the cultural, ritual things around religion, but we don't have this illusion, this pressure to say God exists and to try to prove that. Instead of saying God exists, we can say God is real. This thing is real. What it describes and the ability to hold a people together, not just for a short amount of time, but for a long amount of time. And I would say that the reason that religions talk about eternity is because eternity is the goal of a successful strategy for reproducing and building a civilization. If you extract the principles from an idea, from a system, a complex organization, a network, if you extract that on a long enough timeline, then you can actually measure how good that system is. And I would say what we call God and spirituality is whatever it is that allows that to go on for infinity. And that is how we can live forever. By creating this system. We may never get there. Probably won't, because there's always rough edges. But we can still hone it. We can still try to draw that perfect circle and get to that place where we don't have to worry about things constantly falling apart. So that is the goal of religion, in my opinion. And Steph has warmed to the Christians much, much more. He did this video about why I was wrong about Christians, and I think that's also admirable. It's showing that, okay, there was information that he didn't have before. His information was informed by a lot of the atheists that he surrounded himself, who were decent, logical people, not the crazy leftists that often dominate atheist circles nowadays. So that's an important factor to consider, and I think that forming alliances between philosophers and religious institutions is vital, and that is what's going to support the family. There's a reason that religious people have more children, right? It's not just an accident. It's because they actually have something greater than themselves that they put their faith in. Okay, moving on to pro-white, pro-Western. I give Stefan a B+. Now, he does pretty well, especially in his more recent podcasts and such. He talks about the fact that there are these racial quotas that are biased against white people. And so from the libertarian standpoint, this is perfectly consistent, at least the Hoppian kind of libertarianism, right? Because this is not something that's natural. This has been imposed on us, a lot of this affirmative action and government quotas. So it's not natural for people to just hate white people, right? That is ginned up by the media, and a lot of people just don't have the facts, and they are not intelligent enough to be critical of the mainstream narrative out there. And that's why we have all this hostility. I mean, there might be hostility just in the sense that, like, no, I want, F you, I want what's best for my group, not what's best for yours. But still, there's no reason why people, non-whites shouldn't be able to negotiate with whites so that they can both get what they want. It is important, and he points out that Western civilization is primarily built up by white people. This is just a fact. And he's done lots of presentations on the truth about slavery, the truth about the Native Americans, all these things that colonialism that are constantly shoved down our throats. I don't know if he's talked about the Holocaust or not, but all these things that are, at least in a red-pilling way, but, all these things that are shoved down our throats, and he just throws it back at him. He says, no, this is all bullshit that has been concocted to make people hate the group that is the most successful, that pushes back the least and stands up for themselves the least, which is white people. He is at least on the side of white people, in this current predicament that we find ourselves in. And as I said before, people used to accuse him of being sort of a cult leader, right? Because he talked about the family, and he talked about the idea that if you don't like your family, you had a wretched childhood, first of all, you should try to reconcile and talk to them about it. But if there is no way forward, then it's best to cut ties. And this is, what was known as the DFU. Fu meaning family of origin. So, yeah, he doesn't use this term anymore, but he does just talk about it still in his call-in shows and so on. A lot of people bring personal issues to him, and he says you don't have an obligation to your parents just because they gave birth to you or give you food or anything, because the infant is the most helpless, and nobody gets to choose their parents. That's the reality of it. So some people call this the alternate approach to bad parenting, peaceful parenting. Steph used to talk about this, and still does to some degree, as sort of a way forward, and he conjectured this is really how we're going to move the society forward, is by raising better children, and the next generation will be better than the last. But I raise the point of the DFU because people would assume that he's attacking the idea of the family itself, because he was saying, well, you don't have an obligation if you really aren't getting what you needed, if you've never gotten, the love, the care, if you've been subjected to abuse all your life, yeah, you don't have to stay. We tell women that all the time. If the man is abusing you, then get out. But we don't tell children this. And I think he makes a fair point, is that the rights of children are still lacking behind. Yes, they're not working in coal mines, but we still treat them like they're lesser human beings, unfortunately. But yeah, I think the idea that, you're criticizing bad parenting and therefore you're against the family is ridiculous. And people kind of draw a parallel between, I think, race, right? If you're criticizing a certain race, well, that means, like, you're against the idea of racial solidarity or whatever. And it's like, no, I really genuinely want to improve the situation of my race. I really want to improve the situation of my family. And unfortunately, with the family, if you don't deal with these things, then a lot of this happens unconsciously and you're not aware of it. So all of this kind of psychology, I think it's important to think about and consider and to gain some amount of self-knowledge. It's not the sexiest thing to talk about, but man, it really makes a difference. And that's why he has gained, I think, such a massive following, is because people come for the current events, people come for the movie reviews and politics and stuff, and they stay for the conversations, the meaty, emotional gut of what he does. So it really demonstrates just how much of a depth this man's work contains. Okay, finally, naming you-know-who. He gets a C+. I'm sure you didn't expect him to be getting a high grade on that. Now, if you listen to one of the episodes, and I'll link it here, Communist Subversion of America, he's talking with this woman guest, and listen to this and tell me he doesn't recognize anything about this particular issue, this particular question. So I'm willing to kind of be a little bit easy on him because he's in Canada, right? You can't just go around talking about this kind of thing. And again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, sorry, check out my brother's channel. Steph has no problem looking at race and ethnicity when it comes to crime. But when it comes to communism, he just says leftists or elites, or he throws in other dog whistles. And yeah, that's, I dog whistle a lot, even though I've been more explicit than he has. I'm sure he has his reasons for doing this, but we just have to look at it objectively. And one of the purposes of this scorecard is to put pressure on people to, step it up. Talking about this issue is desperately needed if you value free speech, if you value all of these values of liberty. Okay, yeah, so in summation, I give him an overall grade of an A-. Some criticisms, might be that, it seems like boundaries come natural to him, and he exemplifies them perfectly on his call-in shows, right? He will cut people off if they're going on too long. He's very good about keeping things interesting for his audience, and I think maybe this is just his personality, but I will criticize him for his book Real-Time Relationships. He might have been projecting his own ability to be assertive with others, and therefore focusing on the issue that was a little more lacking, i.e. connection, empathy, being vulnerable with your couple, with your spouse, your partner. And I think that RTR, as it's coined, real-time relationships, I think that can be really great for like parent-child relationships. But when you get into the partnership thing, the whole thing reminds me of nonviolent communication, which I cringe every time I dig into it. It sounds kind of nice, like, oh, we're going to really work through our issues, but it ends up being almost, I think, kind of degrading. I don't see that as actually an effective way to operate in the world. It's a lot of kind of goo, psychology goo, new agey stuff, and a lot of that just leads to leftism, and leftism leads to degeneracy, and degeneracy leads to communism. So it's a slippery slope. It's like, you do want to have a balance. You don't want to just be this aggressive person. You got to be able to work with people, negotiate, cooperate, but at the same time, have your boundaries, be assertive, and then know when is the right time to really open up with people, and that oversharing is just as dangerous as closing yourself off. Okay, so that's all I had to say at this point on Stefan Molyneux. I hope you enjoyed listening.